for sports medicine, and he is Emerite Professor of Orthopedic Surgery, University of Chicago. And he is the third time to be with us. And I wish all the attendees to ask him whatever they want for the experience, how to publish, how to read paper, how to assess paper. And thank you for your coming, Dr. Reider.
Thank you very much, Professor Ezzat. Well, I know that many of the people here already are reviewers for various journals. Some of you may just be interested in becoming reviewers. I can tell you that I've been an editor for almost 20 years, and I'm still learning how to do this thing better. But I'll share with you what I've learned so far, give you some of my hints for how to review a paper. Now, during this presentation, I'm going to do three things. I'm just going to start with a brief overview of the review process. Then I'm going to make step-by-step suggestions for analyzing each section of the paper. And then finally, I'm going to present to you some ideas for writing the final review with some specific do's and don'ts. Along the way, even if you're not interested in being a reviewer, you'll probably find some of these ideas appropriate for improving the quality of your own writing, or just for reading with a knowledgeable manner articles that you're reading for your own benefit. Now, before you begin your review, I suggest that you kind of do a preview of the paper. And you do this by reading the title and the abstract. This should give you an idea of what the paper is going to be about, and this is what I always do. Now, of course, sometimes the title and the abstract don't really reflect what's in the paper. So after you finish the paper, you need to reread the title and abstract to make sure that they're actually a reflection of the content of the paper. As you read through the paper, I recommend that you mark things on the side of the manuscript. This will allow you to write the review much more easily when you get to the end, because you'll have all your ideas already in the margins. Now, you can do this physically by printing out the paper and writing on it, or you can do it electronically, which is what I do, by going right on the computer screen with an application such as Adobe Acrobat that allows you to make notes right on the electronic copy of the paper. One thing that I think is important in any paper is that it should have an overall design, a connecting thread, and you should look for this. In a scientific paper, usually the hypothesis or principal research question is that connecting thread, and it should appear in all parts of the paper. So, for example, on our typical IMRAD arrangement of a paper, the introduction explains why and how the hypothesis was developed and ends in a statement of the hypothesis. Then the materials and methods section explains how the hypothesis was tested. The results obviously report the results of testing the hypothesis. And then the discussion addresses what the results say about the hypothesis and puts this in perspective of the existing literature. So let's go through the paper one part at a time and discuss each part. Obviously, the first thing you come to is the title. The title should actually accurately reflect what was said, what was done, or what was found in the study. Sometimes this ends up being a very long, rambling title, and that's not very good. So you should think about suggestions you might make for shortening the title and making it more succinct. And again, obviously, you need to recheck this title after you finish reading the paper to make sure it's actually an accurate reflection of the paper. The same thing goes for the abstract. Now, I think the abstract is arguably the most important part of the paper because, frankly, this may be the only part of the paper that most people ever read. Usually they'll read the abstract and then maybe they'll read the paper, or maybe they don't have a subscription to the journal so they can only read the abstract. So think of this as a miniature paper and make sure that it correctly and succinctly summarizes the most important points of the study. The abstract should tell you why the study was done, or the background, what question was asked, the hypothesis, how the authors attempted to answer the question, the study design and methods, what the answer was, the results, and finally the clinical conclusions or take-home points that can be derived from the results. Now, some journals have a structured abstract with sections like this that just have to be filled in, but even if there's no structured abstract, All this material really, I think, should be contained in every abstract of every paper. Personally, I think it's much more important for the abstract to have some actual results. So a statement such as this, group 1 was better than group 2 with a p-value, that's pretty meaningless. I think you need to have some more meat in that abstract. So the second way I've written it here, where we have the actual scores, the actual variance, and the actual p-value, tells you a lot more. And especially with the actual scores, you can tell how much difference there actually was and whether that statistically significant difference was actually clinically significant. So my advice to authors and to reviewers too is to worry more about the content of the abstract rather than the word count. I don't worry about the word count too much. Let's move on to the introduction of the paper. This is a fairly short but important part of the paper because it should logically lead up to the hypothesis or the principal research question and explain to the reader why it's important to know the outcome of the research. In other words, the introduction should make you want to read the rest of the paper because you want to know the answer to the question. I always say that a statement such as, "this has never been done before," that's a very poor reason for doing a study. It may never have been done before because everyone thinks the answer is obvious, really tell you why it's important to know that information. Now, as I said, the introduction shouldn't be too long. The key statements should be supported with references, but the details are really left for the discussion of the paper. And as you read that introduction, ask yourself, is the literature being fairly summarized here, or are the authors sort of just selectively quoting parts of the literature to support their point of view? This is something you're going to ask yourself during the discussion as well. Let's move on to the materials and methods section. Now, the overall question you need to think about as you're reading this: is the experimental design capable of testing the hypothesis or answering the principal research question of the study? Sometimes it just isn't. Let's look at a few details that you should look for in any materials and methods section. First of all, obviously in clinical studies, you want to know about the study population. It's usually possible to tell how many patients were in the study, but the authors may not say how they were selected. That's important. And another thing that is very often omitted that's very important is how many patients weren't studied. In other words, how many were lost to follow-up. Authors are usually happy to say, well, we were reporting 450 ACL reconstructions, but they may try not to tell you that that's only 60% of the ones they did during that period of time, and of course that could really bias their results. Now, in a comparative study, the best way to make sure that the two groups are the same, obviously, is to randomize them, but that's not always done. So if the patients are in two groups and they're not randomized, you need to see if the authors explain what steps were taken to make sure that the two groups were equivalent. And this could be done in the selection of the patients, or it could be done by matching or using data analysis techniques afterwards. Now, obviously, most of the studies we're going to be reviewing are surgical studies, and there are important things that we need to know: the indications for the surgery and the contraindications or exclusion criteria. Often an author will say, well, I'm reporting 400 rotator cuff repairs, but what were their criteria for doing them? Did the patients have to fail conservative treatment first? Obviously, details like that will tell you what to expect from the patients in the study. And if there are two procedures being compared in the study, how are the patients allocated to each procedure? This is often omitted too, so it's something to really look for and ask for in review if the authors don't tell you, because the way the patients were allocated to, let's say, a double row repair or a single row repair could really bias the results if all the more difficult cases were allocated to one technique or the other. Now, I think it's really important in a surgical study that the operation be described in pretty great detail. For example, if it's an ACL study, the author should tell you exactly how they place their tunnels, because that's going to tell you what to expect from the results and what is really being tested. And of course, you should also ask yourself, was the operation consistently done for all the subjects? Often in a retrospective case series, the authors kind of change their technique over the years, and so it may not be so consistent. Now, of course, the outcomes have to be measured with some sort of measuring instrument. And nowadays, it's usually a patient-reported outcome measure, such as the IKDC score for the knee, for example. You need to ask yourself if that score is validated for that use. And more importantly, here's something that I think is very often left out. Exactly how was the follow-up done? Did they examine the patients? That's usually the best way of doing things. Did they just contact them on the telephone or via the internet? Or maybe they just reviewed whatever data happened to be in their charts. Obviously, that's the least desirable way of doing it. And often that detail is omitted from the paper. You also need to ask yourself if the follow-up was long enough. And that's going to vary depending upon the outcome that they're looking for. So if it's an ACL study, for example, and they're only reporting the main outcome is whether they returned to sports or not, probably 2 years is sufficient. But if the outcome is whether there are degenerative changes, then maybe you really should expect 10 years or 15 years follow-up to really be appropriate for that outcome measure. Another thing that's often missing from papers is who did the evaluation, what their qualifications were, and whether they were blinded to the group that the patients were allocated to, or at least impartial. Now, the statistical analysis is usually the last portion of the methods that's described. And frankly, I'm not a statistician, and I suspect that many of you aren't either. But I do recommend, nevertheless, that you read through the statistics portion, because you may know something about statistics, and some things may jump out at you that are badly done. And frankly, after reading many statistics sections, I've learned a lot about statistics over the years, and you probably will too if you make yourself read those statistics sessions. One thing that's certainly important in any comparative study is what we call the sample size calculation, or the power analysis. And this is often missing, although nowadays we're seeing it more and more often. So the author should tell you how they figured out how many patients they had to have in each group to really be able to tell whether there was a difference or not. Okay, the next section is obviously the results section of the paper. This should be very clearly written and complete. I'm always a little suspicious of graphs because they can sometimes obscure some uncomfortable details that the authors don't really want you to see. So I kind of like tables, but we accept graphs too. The main thing is that all the results should be reported and not just the ones that the authors want you to see. Now here's an important point. The most important results in the paper are probably going to be reported in several places. They're going to be in the abstract, they're going to be in the text of the paper, and they're going to be in the tables or the figures. And unfortunately, sometimes with a careless author, these results will differ from one portion to another. And that usually shows either the authors were careless, or maybe worse, they kind of fudge some of the results. So always check to make sure the results are the same in each section of the paper. Okay, finally we'll encounter the discussion section of the paper. It's important for this to begin by briefly summarizing the most important findings of the study. This is probably only a few sentences, but it allows the reader ultimately to kind of coalesce in their mind what exactly this study showed. And it should clearly state whether the hypothesis was supported or refuted. Now, all authors pretty much are happy to point out the strengths of their study, but every study has some sort of weaknesses or limitations. And it's important that authors point these out. And if they don't, certainly you need to think, what are the limitations of this study? Because I'm going to ask the authors to write that up when they revise this paper. Ultimately, you'll have to decide if the limitations are just that, weaknesses or limitations, but they don't preclude publication of the paper, or if they're maybe just unacceptable. Discussion should also point out the clinical significance of the findings. I can tell you one of the things that I admire most is when I see in a paper the authors have written well, this difference is statistically significant, but it's really so small that it's not clinically significant. That's a really honest author that's willing to look at his or her results objectively. Now, discussion should place the study in perspective with whatever existing literature is out there. And again, as I said in the introduction, it's important for you to ask yourself, is this literature review balanced, or are the articles selected to support the author's point of view? Often there are discrepancies between their findings and the findings of other similar studies in the literature, and the authors should always make an effort, even if it requires some hypothesizing, to explain why their findings are different. And again, if they didn't, you need to ask them for this in your review. What about the references? This is sort of a very dull thing to look at, but I think it's important. You need to look over the reference list and ask yourself, are there some important references missing, or perhaps some recent references that the authors didn't know about, or they didn't really want to quote because they didn't like what they said? And then you may want to look at the most important references and ask yourself if they actually say what the authors say that they say. Now, you may think, well, I don't know all the literature. Believe me, none of us know all the literature, but with the current manuscript management systems that most journals have, you can click on the links on the references, and it takes you at least to the abstract and PubMed of that article, and you can quickly see whether it really supports what the authors say it did. Okay, finally, we're ready to write up the review. You need to begin by asking yourself, does this study add to the literature? That's sort of the basic question for any review. The first thing you need to decide is, what is my overall opinion of this study? And there's sort of 4 levels of enthusiasm you might have for a study. The first is this. This definitely will be acceptable after some minor corrections or clarifications. That's kind of the most favorable impression you might have, and that usually means you're asking for a minor revision. Second level of enthusiasm is this. This paper is promising, but some clarifications are needed, and it's possible that the wrong answer could lead to rejection. This probably leads to what we call a major revision request. A little less enthusiastic would be this. I hate to reject this paper, but there are deficiencies that will require major work. Well, in that case, you need to sort of decide, is it realistic that the authors will make those major changes or add patients or lengthen their follow-up? And if you think it's not realistic, you're probably going to recommend rejection. If you think it could happen, then that's also a major revision. And then finally, the lowest level of enthusiasm is when you conclude revisions just cannot make this paper acceptable, and you're going to recommend a rejection. Now, as you write up, it's important to be organized. Start with an introductory paragraph that summarizes the major strengths and weaknesses of the paper and ends in a clear statement of your recommendation. Many reviewers are just too polite to actually say in the review, I think this paper should be rejected. But if you don't say that, obviously in a kind way, then the authors will be confused, like, why was my paper rejected when none of the reviewers thought it should be rejected? Anyway, after that first paragraph, then you kind of develop your major ideas, your major points in subsequent paragraphs. And it's really important that even if you really didn't like the paper, the review should be at least 4 or 5 paragraphs long, so that the authors feel that you really gave them a fair shake and that you spent some time thinking about their paper. Here's the first point. If you're recommending a rejection, write a review that you would like to receive if it were your paper being rejected. Just always remember, there's a real person at the other end that's going to be reading your review. They have feelings, and they probably did their best. So you want to compliment them. Find something in the paper that you can compliment. Sometimes it's just the subject. Maybe they did a bad job investigating it, but it was a good question. There's always something you could compliment, so start by doing that. And as then you continue, definitely support your points with citations from the text or references that really support your point of view. If you're recommending rejection, start with a similar introductory paragraph, but then go through the paper page by page to those notes you made in the margin, making specific recommendations. Avoid general statements. I think I'm going to need a few more, another minute or so. So don't say the discussion is too long. Yeah. But make a specific request, such as this: summarize these lines in 2 sentences, omit these details, because frankly, if the authors knew how to write better, they probably would have done so. Nobody sets out to write a bad paper. So if they did some points badly, they probably need some help, and you need to tell them exactly what they need to do. So you need to ask for the changes you want to see. List major missing references if they're needed, and back up your assertions with references. If you just say, well, this is not new information, the authors will say, well, I think it is. But if you actually cite the references that already explore this issue, then they can't really argue with that. I think the most important point of any review is to be fair. Judge scientifically, not emotionally. In other words, don't enthusiastically review a paper because you like its findings, even if it's poorly done. And on the other hand, don't attack the paper and recommend that it be rejected, even if it's very well done, just because you don't like its findings. Whoops. As you write, it's important to avoid hyperbole, exaggeration. Don't impute unethical motivation. In other words, don't say, I think the authors are trying to mislead us here. It's possible that they are, but it's hard to know that they really are. So you would just say, well, this paragraph is misleading. Never display irritation or anger. Don't use sarcasm or colorful language. Here's one statement that I had to edit out of a review. The quote, statistical analysis was a joke, exclamation point. I just changed it to the statistical analysis was flawed. Says the same thing, but it's not quite so insulting. Frankly, there's almost no reason to ever have quotation marks or an exclamation point in a review. They almost always will be taken as being sarcastic. Here's one of the worst statements I've ever had to edit out of a review. This adds nothing to my understanding of ankle sprains. The writing was substandard, and I don't even think there was a conclusion. If there was, I missed it. This article is not worthy of publication in OJSM. If that's not arrogant, I don't know what was. So I rewrote it, saying the same thing, but in much more neutral language. So to summarize, the best studies start with a clearly stated relevant hypothesis or question, utilize scientific methods that are capable of answering the question, clearly state the results of the investigation, and we're just at the end. Acknowledge the strengths and weaknesses of the study, discuss the results in the context of the existing literature, and finally, do not make any unwarranted conclusions. And by extension, the best reviews evaluate the study in an organized and thorough manner, evaluate it objectively and in detail, and give the authors very specific guidance for improving their manuscript. Thank you so much for your attention. Shukran.
Now, any question in your mind, write it in paper, and will be the second speaker. Our guest, Dr. Charles Bush Joseph, and he is professor of Department of Orthopedic Surgery, Rush University in Chicago, and he is past president of American Orthopedic Society for Sports Medicine, and he will give us what he needs for the Journal of Sports.
I just a real brief comment before we get on to Bruce's second talk on going over the open access. Then I think afterwards, I'm sure we all have some questions on how the editor actually reviews the reviewers. And we want to, obviously the role, the mechanics of the review we discuss, but there's some second level questions that I want to ask you as well. So I think we'll let you go through the update on our open access journal before, and then we'll get to some questions. So please write your questions down. I want him to, Bruce is going to continue, assuming his voice is back.
Okay, so I'm very proud of our affiliation with EGAA and the Orthopedic Journal of Sports Medicine. A lot has happened in the last year, so I wanted to give you a little update. Start with just a brief review of open access in general. The most pure open access journal is a gold open access, which means the entire journal is freely available without any paywall, any subscription needed from the date of publication. Other flavors of open access would be green, where it's a subscription journal, but after 6 months or a year, the articles or some form of them become open access, or what's called a hybrid journal, which is a subscription journal in which the authors pay an extra fee to make a specific article open access. What are the benefits of open access? Well, there are really quite a few. Certainly for authors, whatever they've written is much more accessible, and they definitely get more downloads, and some studies show even more citations. Now, of course, you can always post your articles on your own website or your university website, but being in an open access journal means that your manuscript is reviewed, it's edited, you have the validation of peer review and third-party approval of what you've written. And then finally, you have indexing, of course, and perpetual accessibility because you're in a journal. And if whoever funded your research requires open access, it fulfills that mandate. Barriers are no longer a problem, so that's a great advantage to readers. Also, there's more liberal use of content with some restrictions. And again, compared with just being posted on ViewMedi or a website like that, the content has been vetted by peer review. Now, you probably know that there's some very low quality open access journals out there, so-called predatory journals. But if you're an author thinking of publishing in an open access journal, there are a number of signs of quality that you can look for. I won't go through all of them here, but I've highlighted a few in gold. Certainly just looking at the content of the journal and judging its quality is very important. Asking if the journal is affiliated with a society like EGAA or the OJSM, because frankly, societies don't want to be affiliated with second-rate or predatory journals. Looking to see if the journal is indexed in PubMed, SCOTUS, or the Journal Citation Reports, which bestows the impact factor, and then to see whether the journal gives fee modifications for authors from low-income countries, because again, unscrupulous open access journals are just looking to make as much money as possible. Now, a new development that is really, I think, going to be a big push for open access is so-called Plan S. This is a plan adopted by a number of European countries and their university systems that require all their papers to be published in a gold open access journal. Now, this was actually supposed to start in January of this year, and they've kind of postponed it a bit, but there's still a lot of pressure from these European countries for open access deals from various publishers. So let's talk specifically about OJSM, the Orthopedic Journal of Sports Medicine. I'm editor-in-chief of this journal. Obviously, I'm quite proud of it. It's gold open access, so as the articles are published, they're immediately freely accessible all over the world. OJSM is indexed in PubMed, SCOTUS, and what was a fantastic development for us, in June of 2019, we received our first impact factor, and it's a very good one, 2.589, as you see here. OJSM is also very active in social media, and at the last count, we have almost 24,000 followers. Now, I have a lot of help in doing this journal, because you know I'm also the editor-in-chief of OJSM, and that's a lot on my plate. And these three gentlemen, Don Fithy, Keith Kenner, and Dan Washer, review all the papers. and they really are they do a tremendous job helping me with the editing. This is the landing page of the journal, and there's a lot of information there. You can find the latest articles, the most read articles, the most cited articles, and you can look through all the different issues of the journal. One of the features of the journal that I think is really exciting and really interesting is that for each article, you can find article-specific metrics. So this is what's called an alt metric page for each article, and you will see on there something like this, and that's called an alt metric donut or article attention score. And this tells you how many people have tweeted about it, how many people have put it on their Facebook page, how many news articles have been about it. And if you click on each of these lines here, you can actually read every tweet, every news article, every Facebook page, if you're so inclined. And then this sort of world map here tells you where all the tweets have come from. Also, you can find more traditional statistics, like how many times the article has been downloaded and how many times it's been cited by other articles. Now, here's something that I really would like to emphasize for the EGAA, and that's one of these features that we have for our partner societies. All the partner societies can publish their abstracts in OJSM for free, and I would really encourage the EGAA to publish the abstracts from this meeting in OJSM. This doesn't prejudice eventually publication of the full papers in other journals or in any journal of your choice, and it's a good way of having all the presentations indexed in PubMed because they're all individually searchable. Also, we publish the position statements of our partner societies, and this is something the EGAA could consider as well. Now, speaking of partner societies, I think one of the secrets of the success of OJSM has been the acceptance really worldwide of its partner societies. We now have 32 partner societies supporting OJSM in all the inhabited continents of the world, and of course we're particularly proud of our association with EGAA. Now, this graph shows how OJSM has grown over time, and you can see here when we look from 2013 when the journal started, just an incredible increase in the number of submissions, with a big jump in 2019, of course, when we got our impact factor. And I can tell you that 2020 is even way ahead of this 2019 pace. But it's not just submissions. Open access means that more people are reading the articles in the journal. And I think you can see here, I kind of highlighted January on the left here, for example. And if you look at each color bar is a succeeding year, with the last bar showing January of 2020. And the number of accesses is just exploding. We had well over 140,000 accesses, full text downloads from the journal just in the month of January alone. And this simple graph kind of shows you the difference between a subscription journal and open access. On the left here, we have OJSM, which is, I would say, a very good journal. And it requires subscription, however, or your library has to have a subscription. And if we look at this, so OJSM had a little over 1,200,000 full-text downloads in 2019, and OJSM, which hasn't been around as long and has fewer articles, had over 1,600,000 full-text downloads in the same year. So it just shows when there's no financial barrier to reading articles, more people read them. Now, open access, of course, means there's no charge for reading it. So how do open access exist? How do we pay the salaries of our employees? Usually by what are called article processing charges, or APCs, that the authors or their sponsors pay at the time that an article is accepted, not for submission, only for acceptance. Now, in most countries of the world, the fee for members of partner societies is $900 for an article or $1,200 for unaffiliated authors. But OJSM has a steep discount for authors from World Bank lower middle income countries, and that happens to include Egypt, so that $900 is discounted to $300 for members of partner societies such as the EGAA. And if there were unaffiliated members from Egypt or other lower middle income countries, they would pay $400. Now, of course, even sometimes that can be a barrier, and I recommend that you go to this website. It's called openscience.com. It gives you a lot of hints for how you can finance these article processing charges. So in conclusion, OJSM continues to grow in stature in the orthopedic sports medicine community. Being selected for journal citation reports in 2019 was certainly a big boost to our success. And finally, we're very proud of our affiliation with EGAA, and I encourage you to include the abstracts from this meeting in OJSM. Thank you.
Bruce, that was an excellent summary. Do we have questions? And while people are considering their questions, Bruce, I want to just take you back to the editorial function to one point. And it was an excellent mechanics explanation for us, which I think is very helpful. The one thing that I struggle with sometimes as a reviewer is the paper that I think is reasonably well constructed and really has meaningful and important data. And the conclusions are generally well supported by the data, but the author sometimes uses that license to expand expand upon their global opinions on a given topic. What advice would you give us as reviewers to sort of narrow the discussion to really relevant facts that are supported by the data, as opposed to general opinion that sort of expands well beyond the topic of the study?
Well, I think you said it right there. As I said during my presentation, you need to make specific recommendations. So in your review, you would say exactly what you just said to me, that it's a very good study. The main conclusions are supported by the study. However, and then you sort of list the things that aren't supported by the study, and you have to say diplomatically, these are not supported by the study, and I think you need to remove them, or maybe just that these are your opinions, and you need to clearly state these are your opinions, but they're not definitely supported by the data. I do think if someone has a study, and it's a good study, it gives them a little bit of a license to express some opinions in the discussion, as long as they clearly mark them as their opinions and not something that they've proven in the study.
Can I have just a quick show of hands? Who in the audience is a reviewer for any journal? So fair amount. And again, I would encourage younger members, I think this is your way of really educating yourself, getting experience in evaluating the literature, and both contributing to the science. So as these opportunities develop and your senior mentors can help guide you with that, I think that's an opportunity that all young orthopedic surgeons should entertain.
Yes, I would definitely recommend to members of the audience, if you'd like to be a reviewer for a journal, and not just my journals, arthroscopy, whatever journal you'd like to be a reviewer for, write the editor of that journal. Usually their email addresses are pretty visible in the journal, and tell them you want to be a reviewer, and they'll give you a chance. We're always looking for enthusiastic people that are willing to put in the time to do a good review, because obviously it does take time. I'm always impressed by how much effort people put into their reviews. Sometimes they write pages and pages, and it's obvious they spend hours doing it. So we're always looking for people that are willing to make that commitment, and it's a wonderful contribution to society and to our profession.
Thank you. So further discussion will be in the break with Dr. Reider, and we go now for the second speaker, Dr. Charles Bush from Rush University, talk to us.
Is there any further questions?
We have a lot of questions. Yeah. But Dr. Adil is looking to me. Sometimes, Dr. Reider, that the reviewer is not that good in statistics. So what you advise him to do if he is like P factor you was referring to, they said it is not the standard of judgment now.
Many reviewers are not good in statistics. I'm not so great in statistics either. That's why we have a PhD in epidemiology and statistics that I can rely on if I really have some difficult questions. But for a reviewer, we don't expect you to be an expert in everything. So if you're not an expert in statistics, just say that in your notes to the editor. You know, you might say, well, these statistics look a little bit funny to me, but I'm not really an expert. Maybe you want to have your statistics consultant look at them. So, you know, that might be all that you would say. And so we certainly don't expect everybody to be an expert in statistics, especially nowadays. Some of the statistics you see in these papers are very obscure.
You know, Bruce, one last thing before we move on to the next section. Can you explain to that many institutions now reward young members of academic departments for reviewing? What are the opportunities that our young surgeons would consider in becoming a reviewer beyond just the pure educational pleasure?
Yes, well, we try to reward our reviewers as much as possible because we know they put in a lot of work and they're not getting any financial remuneration for it. So one thing that we use, and we're not the only journal by any means that do, is what's called Publons. Publons is a public website that gives you recognition for the reviews that you do. So every time you do a review for one of our journals, and as I said, other journals too, you check a box and you automatically get credited on your Publons webpage. So when you're applying for promotion at your university or your institution, you can show them your Publons report, and it shows how many reviews you've done and what journals you've done them for. So that's certainly one major way. We have started sending certificates to all our reviewers every year, telling them how many reviews that they did. We give them free access to all the journals of our publisher, Sage, for a month every time they do their reviews. And these are just a few of the ways that we thank them. We're always sort of looking for new things. Obviously, we publish the names of the reviewers in the journal every year. We're always looking for new ways that we can thank them publicly as well as privately.
Well, I think if there's no further questions, I think we'll move on to the Arthroscopy Association North America session, and I think Dr. Reider deserves an applause.